Hello everybody, welcome to this Dynamic Boards NED Community meetup. So our topic for today is employee engagement and our speaker is Melanie Richards, CBE. Melanie Richards has an extensive NED experience and was the Deputy Chair of KPMG. She's currently a NED at Morgan Stanley International and HKA, and she's a trustee of the Royal National Theatre and the Invictus Games Foundation, and she's Chair of Azets, the 7th largest tax and accounting business in the UK. So Melanie, thank you for being with us. As an opening question, why is employee engagement so important?
I thought actually before I sat down to do this, I thought, why don't I go and Google what Google tells us about employee engagement, and then I'll compare that with what I think. And I think I do a pretty good job, right? It's how connected and motivated individuals feel in their roles. How do they see leadership? And all of that leads to what's the culture of the organisation. And of course, when you think about sitting in a boardroom, there is a risk you couldn't be more disconnected from employees and getting information that's extremely filtered on all of those topics. And so a big part of, I think, being on a board is not just how is the business operating, fundamentally, what is the culture of the organisation? How do things get done? And is that leading to better performance? That's how I think about it.
I know you've got a lot of experience in this area and partly from that KPMG role as well. So how does the board collectively get a sense of employee engagement?
Well, I'm going to say something contentious to start, which is I think that we all started leaning very, very heavily on employee engagement surveys. And I think particularly during the pandemic, we kind of used that as a kind of a barometer of how things were. We weren't seeing, people moving around organizations, and we sort of made that become the thing that we went to, the go-to thing. And I'm not discrediting employee engagement surveys entirely, but I think if we lean too heavily on that as our sole source of information, it can be misleading. I also do think that employees have become a little bit sort of practiced in how they answer questions. And I think in some organizations, there's a bit of a risk. They're encouraged to complete them and do it in a way that is not necessarily as objective as it could be. So the things that I look at, and generally on the boards I'm in, that we kind of try and synthesize as pieces of information, are actually the profile of employees. And I don't mean just gender mix or race mix or whatever else, but also where people are coming from. Have we got one type of person in the organization? Do we reward one type of person? Do we promote one type of person? I look at attrition, particularly regretted attrition. And I think one has to be careful about how that's defined. But overall, what does that look like? I look at what happens when people join. When we get new joiners into the organization, do they stick? Or do we find that there are some places where they're not sticking and they're not staying? And why might that be? Sickness records are often a very good barometer of how people are feeling about an organisation. And then exit interviews. Not all organisations do them, but on the boards I'm on, I encourage exit interviews to be done and to be done as independently as they can. And then the other thing that I think is particularly useful is Glassdoor. I mean, clearly that tends to be a more useful piece of information if you're in a larger organisation. But Glassdoor is how people feel about the organisation as they leave. And some people will discredit it and say, well, that's when they're least happy. But it's also when they're leaving, and there's a reason usually that they're leaving. The last pieces of information is whistleblowing and disciplinaries and how we're rewarding people. So that's quite a lot of information, but put together in the right way, starts to give you a real sense of what's actually going on in the organisation.
Thank you, Mel. And how can boards ensure that those engagement metrics are truly reflective of that employee experience and not just like tick box KPIs?
I think there's two things. One is the willingness with which you are being given the information is actually a barometer for me. I'm pleased to say that in all of the organisations I work with, I've never sort of had lots of calibration of the information's given to me as it is and as it shows, and of course then provides a good opportunity for a conversation. And I think a really good barometer is your own leadership team looking at those things themselves. So if this is kind of new news, that this kind of synthesized information needs to be looked at, then I'd sort of be slightly concerned about that. So I think asking for the information, gauging reaction, understanding how they're using it, not judging how they're using it. I think that's the other thing is if you're trying to create an environment in which the executive feel that they can be open with you, listen to what they do have to say and don't jump to conclusions on it. But as I say, I think the biggest barometer is, are they using the information? How are they using it? And how do they think about it? And what are they doing about anything that comes out of it?
So what would be the kind of red flags in board discussions that might indicate employee engagement is being neglected or misunderstood at executive level?
The first and obvious thing I've already said, which is how much do people get attention in an organisation? And, I have the privilege of working mainly in organisations that are entirely dependent upon, I think all organisations are dependent on people and the quality of their people. But in the organisations I've run and led and now sit on the board of, we're utterly dependent. We don't have products that we make that we deliver to people. We have advice and we have services, and all of those advice and services, yes, AI is starting to play a role, etc. But all of those services are being provided by people. And so you'd sort of be disappointed if people didn't feature as quite a large part of the agenda. So I think it's always interesting when you think about agenda setting, when you have a strategy discussion, do people feature and how do they feature and what's the nature and focus of the conversation? So I guess the reverse of that is if they don't feature at all, then that's a big red flag, right? If a discussion about employees doesn't happen. The other thing I would say is you've sort of started to allude to it, which is a conversation in which a senior leadership team is, if you like, trying to disprove a negative the whole time and not looking at information to think about ways of continuously improving. And I put that on any subject, but I think it's particularly critical on this one, because I think we all have a tendency to project our own personal perspectives into things. Well, they feel like this, they think like that. And actually, our job is to spend time understanding what they're thinking and feeling. And executive teams or boards that don't want to discuss those two factors, I think, are missing a trick.
Can you share any examples of where a board's culture or governance approach positively or negatively impacted the workforce engagement?
I think there's a broader question, isn't there, which is, are the board being used, are the skills around the board table being maximised and deployed into the business in any way, shape or form? Now, there are several models. You can have the completely anonymous board that sits in a kind of, metaphorically, a glass box that has no engagement with people, and the business is not cited, if you like, on the board and the individuals who are around the table beyond maybe their CVs appearing. I am exaggerating for effect, by the way, their CVs appearing in a sort of a report and accounts. Or do you have board executives who are playing parts? And I think where I've seen it work particularly well is where the executives are pursuing a particular agenda. They may have events that they're organising that they actually positively pull board members into, not the entire board, but individual board members, maybe because they've got a background in technology and they think it would be that, why would they not lean on the skills of the people around their board table? That doesn't preclude them from going outside of the board and bringing in interesting speakers, etc. But I think it's a mark of kind of collaborative working around the board table between execs and non-execs when there is a bit of a pull on the board. And then when those board members appear in those settings, supporting, if you like, the direction of travel, the performance management, the strategy, in a way that demonstrates how critical some of the thinking that may be making it to an employee's desk, where it started and how it began.
Thank you, Mel. How can NEDs or chairs ensure that the employee voice is meaningly represented at board level, especially in companies without formal worker representation on the board? I know that's not that common in the UK at the moment.
I think there was one business, and I don't know if they still have it, Capita, which is a listed PLC, were quite unique in that they did have 2 employees as board representatives. And I know actually it was a very positive experience on both the board side and those particular representatives. I've always been a bit conflicted on this question of employee representation. Part of me thinks it would be amazing, and then part of me worries that it's still only two people, and then do you lean too heavily if it's one person or two people on that person? In the same way as taking the lead as a NED for employee engagement, I've always said doesn't mean you're the only person who needs to engage with employees, and it's more about how do you orchestrate yourselves as a team. Yeah. I think the simplest way is actually engaging with people, and the way in which I've done it is through a number of ways. One is going out to visit particular offices, asking to go and visit an office and be walked around the floor. It doesn't tell you everything, but it gives you a bit of a vibe. You know, there's a little bit of a risk, even if you do board meetings in different locations within the business, there's a little bit of a risk you're getting quite a filtered view, whereas even just turning up on the floor and actually meeting people and understanding what they do makes a huge difference. And some pretty carefully curated sessions with employees. So with one of my businesses, I do 8 to 10 sessions a year with at least 25 employees. And that's in addition to some of the other things that mean that I'm actually engaging with people. And I specifically request that they are not curated groups, that they are people who they are given the opportunity to attend and they attend. But I think there is a responsibility when you do that to remember that your voice is quite influential. And therefore you have to be quite measured and thoughtful about how you represent the organisation. But I think the more relaxed you can make that environment, the more you hear. And very often, I think a very good barometer in those circumstances are people who've recently joined the organisation and getting a bit of a barometer of how that compares to where they've come from, how they feel about the way in which they've been inducted, and how they feel about the way in which they are being led, which, as we know, is not by faceless people in a boardroom. It's by their sort of lived experience of the person who's line managing them. So I think taking time to do that is critical. But then I think also synthesizing that and playing it back to the executive in an anonymized way is also critical, and making it valuable for them as well as for the non-executive group.
So, Mel, how far is too far for the NEDs to go? So should NEDs chairs be playing any role in overseeing things like internal communications that go out to the staff, or any of the internal comms practices?
It's interesting you framed it as the sort of when you go too far, etc. I mean, I think internal comms is a matter for the executive. But there will be exceptions, right? And also there may be members of the board who have a particular value around communication. So, for example, one of the boards I'm on, one of the persons specialises in communications. So periodically she is lent upon to give a second opinion on a set of comms that are going out or a Q&A. But that's because her personal expertise is being lent on, as opposed to the board operating, sort of making decisions by committee on what I would call day-to-day management issues. But as I say, there are exceptions. For example, during the financial crisis, I was advising a lot of businesses on fairly fundamental restructurings of their organisations. And in those circumstances, often final comms would be shared with the board as a kind of more of a sense check that we've covered the bases, that we're represent, because internal and external comms, I would say, are melded these days. You know, the nature of communication is such that to call it pure internal comms is probably a little flawed. But I suppose there are moments where some of these things are appropriate, but I think as a norm, absolutely not. And I think the same is true for the engagement question, which is, you know, when's too much? If for example, every single NED is doing 15 sessions, you know, a year, that's a big thing for the organisation to organise, and B, I think sort of starts to tip into probably too much. So I think it's sense checking the whole time, whether you're doing enough to get enough of a view and a bit of a lens on things. And of course, recognising that there are things that might be concerns that you need to dig into. that doesn't give you universal sort of charge over digging into everything in great depth. It's a bit like the Goldilocks test, isn't it? Not too much, not too little, just right. And you kind of know it and you feel it when you get it right.
So, do the executive know and feel it? That's the next question. And our final question for you, Mel. So, when we've discussed this before as an NED community, we've heard some of our members share their fear or experience of the executive finding this challenge or feeling like they're going to be undermined by the board when they're looking to sort of get to know the next level down of employees and get a sense from that culture by talking to people in the organisation. So what tips would you give for people who are sort of working out how not to overstep?
I think if an executive is reacting in a kind of negative way, it's not always because they're just being resistant. It's sometimes because at the heart of it, there's a sort of a trust point going on, which is, I've got an ecosystem I'm managing on a day-to-day basis, and then you're asking me to be able to sort of just go and be let loose. And I think it's, step by step, really. So I have reached the point with all of my executive that if I do sessions and I do them on my own, and I like to do them on my own because I think it creates a level of trust with the people you're talking to that it really will be anonymised. And there's nothing I've heard so dreadful in any of my organisations that anyone should be worried. But of course, that is the concern for the people you're talking to, and it's the concern for the executive. So I always think step by step. I mean, if a way of everybody feeling comfortable is for the first few, somebody is alongside with you, that you're not doing it on your own, and that there is a sort of an understanding about the nature of questions that are going to be asked. I think you build trust and an understanding with the executive that this isn't about finding anybody out. This is about hopefully contributing to the whole and everybody feeling that they're going to benefit from the information that's gleaned from these sessions as opposed to anything else. And I think the same is true for the information that's provided to you on a synthesized basis. If people overreact to single facts, then trust is slightly breaks down. So I think with all of this, it's about being proportionate and also recognizing that one voice does not speak to the entire culture of an organization. The synthesized views speak to the culture of an organisation. And I think there's a big responsibility on our part, having asked to do this, having probed and poked, etc., that we're handling the information we get proportionally.
Mel, thank you so much. That was such a helpful insight on this topic. So I'm just going to share a few questions with you. So the first question is, how does your board collectively assess employee engagement? And is it working well? The second is, how do you personally get a sense of employee engagement outside of board meetings? And lastly, what do you intend to do differently to improve your ability to judge employee engagement? We're going to have a few minutes of silence now to give you a chance to think about these for yourself, and then we'll jump into breakout rooms afterwards.